Right, video time number 3. We're still prepping Christmas dinner. Well, what we're actually doing is going to cook dinner for us now. So this is a story. I don't think I've shared this on here, but I've been remembering it, so I think maybe God wants me to share it. It's actually to do with one of my patients that I have, and it's really actually part of his testimony, and he's writing a book, so whenever I find out if it gets published or whatever about his life, I'll let you know, because I think it'll be profound. And I'm only sharing this story to show you that God can use you in a way and you won't even know, you won't even realise that you're doing it or what you're saying is impacting that person. So, give me a second to get my carrots. Carrots. So, this man came in to the surgery and he, see, not very prepared. Haha. Peter. Oh, her, right. So he came into the surgery. He's my last client of the day, and he had fallen and he'd busted his whole lip. His whole lip was like a big fat lip. It was so swollen, and there was sutures along here and sutures on the inside of his lip. And this was a Friday afternoon, and I finish on a Friday at 1:30. I do a half day. And this was my very last patient. That is not a coincidence. So he comes in and I'm talking to him and I'm like, oh, you know, what am I doing with you today? And he's like, oh, you need to remove these sutures in my mouth. And I was like, oh, right, okay. Because I hadn't received any instruction from the hospital, because he'd attended hospital and they sent him back to his GP treatment room to sort out his dressing and his sutures, and that would be part of my job. So that was grand. I had a wee look briefly at some of the paperwork, but I didn't read really into it. I was like, it's Friday afternoon, get me out of here. And I remember thinking, okay, the swelling on this man's lip is horrendous. And I said to him, how did this happen? And he said, oh, I fell, and from about 15 foot. And I was like, oh, right, okay, so I am assuming he fell off a ladder or something. In my head, this is what I'm assuming. And I was like, goodness, that's some height, you know. And I said, did you hit your head? And he was like, he says, yeah, like, sure, my lips have gone through, I hit my head like that. And I was like, oh, right, okay. I said, are you in blood thinners? And like my A&E brain started to kick in and triage. And he was like, yes, I am. And I went, did you get a scan in the hospital? And he was like, yeah. And he says, no bleed. And because he told me what blood thinner he was on, or anticoagulant, if you want to be very particular and correct. And I was like, how have you fallen from that height with that impact, and your teeth had gone through, like right through the other side, nearly bit his lip off basically, and you didn't have any like legitimate head injury. And he was like, do you know that? He says, I had no injuries. And I went, right. He says, except for this. He says, oh, I did. I had, my kidney was bruised and it had started to bleed a wee bit. And I went, oh, right, okay. He says, but by the end of the day, it was healed. And I start to, like, get, like, my discernment starts to, like, wee antennae comes up, and I'm like, what's going on here? And he says, aye. He says, but sure, and you know, you won't believe me when I tell you this. And we're chit-chatting. And I start to tell him, I just turn around and I say to him, you see, when it's not your time, it's not your time. I made this flippant comment. I didn't really believe that, you know. And I started to tell him this story about this young man that I looked after in the hospital. That young man is called Peter. Peter is now, he's passed away. And that happened a couple of months ago. I found out when I no longer worked in A&E, I moved to the GP surgery. And Peter used to come into A&E all the time. So I worked there 9, nearly 10 years. And probably for the last 5 of those years, Peter was one of our regular customers. And Peter was a drug addict, and he would have taken a lot of overdoses and come into us. And the God's honest truth, I used to say to myself, like, how are you not dead? Because of the things that he would take. And he would always end up in ICU, intubated. And it's just the saddest thing. He's a lovely young fella, he actually was. And I don't know what's going on in his background, but he never spoke really about his mum, but he spoke about his granny. And he had been brought up by his granny, and he lived with his granny. And there was obviously more issues to Peter's background. But that time, I couldn't have cared less, because I'm living in the world and I am seriously lacking compassion. And I would have cared for Peter, but I would have been quite stern with him. And I'd have said to him, Peter, will you stop this? Taking these overdoses is not good for you. You know, and constantly. But I always had a wee soft spot for him, and I could never hate him. And that was probably the minute amount of inkling of Jesus in me at that time. And this is probably the day before I left A&E, and Peter had come in, and I said to him, this boldness come on me, and I started to feel the compassion for him. And I went over and I says, Peter, will you stop this? I says, it's not your time. You keep trying to kill yourself, because he was suicidal. I says, and the good Lord's not going to take you until he's ready to take you, and it's not yet. Will you stop this? And I started to raise my voice. And the other nurse I was working with, she came over and she was like, Emma, are you okay? She was like, calm it down. And I was like, no. I said, Peter, you're putting yourself, you're trying to do this, and God's not going to take you. He's not going to take you. And I came away from him. And he'd always been like, I know, Emma, I know. And that was the last I seen of Peter. So I started to tell this other man in the GP surgery, so back to the original story, about this instance I had with Peter, and how I shouted at him, God's not going to let you die, it's not your time, stop trying to take your life. Because it's not going to happen, you're wasting your time. And that was fine. And then I was telling him about this story, and he said, Emma, I'm going to say something really strange, and you're going to think I'm crazy when I say this, but the only reason I have for still being alive is because of God. And I went, I don't find that strange at all. I says, a big angel has obviously come down and cushioned you, and that's why you've no injuries. He says, I prayed to God that day about my kidney to heal it. He says, and he did, he healed it within the 24 hours. I had 3 scans, Emma. They were that worried about my kidney. He says, it was completely healed within 24 hours, and the nurses couldn't understand it. He says, and even when I was in the hospital, he sent me Christian Filipino nurses that cared for me and had compassion on me. And he says, and I know why I don't have a bleed in my head, because of God. And I went, right. And we ended the conversation, and away he went. So I'm all like, I can't believe he hasn't had a bleed. I can't believe he's walked out of this trauma without any bleeding. So I goes out to the GP before I go home. And I say to the GP, see that man there? How's he not dead? I says, like, he's fallen from that there height. On a blood thinner and all. And like, I've seen a lot of trauma. I don't know how he's got away with that. And she went, She says, did he tell you what he done? I says, sorry? He says, what? He says he fell from 15 feet. And she went, didn't fall, Emma. And I'm sat confused, and I went, what are you talking about? And she went, he tried to commit suicide. He jumped off a bridge. And I could not believe that. And I was like, no, this man's a Christian. You wouldn't do that. He told me he fell. And she went, no, go and read the notes, the discharge notes from the hospital. Did you not read them? I said, no, I didn't have time. I just believed him when he said that he had fallen. And she went, no. It's not the first time either, Emma. And she says there's a lot more to it in the background. And it'd be quite risky of attempting that again. He's a terrible, terrible things that's happened to him. He's been getting counselling from the GP service for a good while now, but we would be worried about him. And I couldn't believe it, because the same man told me he played saxophone in church, and we laughed because his lip was so swollen he wouldn't be able to play saxophone. And then I got in my car and I was like, Lord, see the demonic attack that's on that man's life. He has a calling or something, and he's under a terrible lot of warfare because they want him taken out. And then God showed me what I had said to him about speaking over Peter, about it wasn't your time, and to stop trying to kill yourself. And then I realised what I had said. And I couldn't believe it, that God had used me to say that to that man. And the man came back a couple of weeks later for blood sampling and stuff, and he said to me, Emma, how are you, love? I said, I'm doing really well, how are you? Now, he didn't know that I knew all of this now, because he just told me he'd fallen. And he said, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write my testimony. A fella in church came up to me and he says, you should write your testimony in a book. He says, and he's helping me, and I am doing it. And I went, brilliant. I said, you see how God can use something out of a bad situation? He says, I know. He came back into me the next time and he says, Emma, my daughter's been diagnosed with cancer. I want you to pray for her. I says, no problem, okay. And he came back into me on the last time, the most recent that I've seen him. And he says, Emma, wait till you hear what God has done. Wait till you hear what God has done. He says, my daughter's cancer free. She rang the bell and she got saved. And he's saying this, the tears are streaming down my face. It's because not only did God save her life, but he just saved her spirit and her soul. And he says, I can't believe it. He says, nothing to do with me, Emma. She says, I know Jesus has healed me, and I know I'm only alive because of him and your prayers. And she says, for that I want to go to church, and I got saved at. So, don't give up. Sometimes we have to go through hard things in our lives to get us to turn around and come back to God, or to come to God, like how she did. Sometimes you just have to be bold and speak out what he tells you to speak, and you don't even realise you're being used as a vessel to tell people not to try to kill themselves, because it's not God's time. That's a spirit that's speaking and lying to your head. And a talented man, played saxophone and everything. So, yeah, I always remember his story and how God brought me people into the treatment room that I worked in to experience all these things and see God working in people's lives. If you're willing to be obedient and to watch and see and listen, God will show you his goodness in other people's lives also, not just your own. And then you can experience how God can save people just like that. So I hope that story has encouraged you. It always encourages me when I think about him and about the trauma, the fall, the trauma that could have been caused to him. Could have took his life, really could have. Anybody that works in emergency care would know that. They usually come out with you know, he didn't even have a broken leg. Unbelievable. So I just thought I would share that with you to encourage us, give you some stories from my life. Yeah, and there'll be more to follow.